It was the end of the first session of the first campaign that I had ever ran. The party had gotten thrust into a very confusing situation at a wedding, and they had befriended the would-be groom at the wedding, but the father of the bride and the groomsmen were very angry with him, and they didn't want the wedding to happen. And so this ended up in a melee where they had to fend off this father of the bride and the groomsmen and the bride, who was still in love with this would-be groom. The two of them ran off together, and the party defended their retreat. It was an interesting session, and right before the end of it, the bride turns to one of the PCs, one who had defended directly against her father, and punched him square in the face when he said this shouldn't be happening. And she said, "Thank you so much. This means so much to me. I can't repay you now, but I want you to have this trinket, this bauble that has meant so much to my family. It's been in my family for generations, and I want you to have it now as a token of my appreciation for what you've done for us today." And she reaches into, I guess, some pouch inside her wedding dress. I didn't really think through that part. But she reaches down and she pulls out a sponge. Today on Bumbling Through Dungeons, we're going to talk about trinkets. The weird, the wild, the wonderful, and how you can incorporate them into your game in ways that add to story arcs in meaningful and interesting ways. Let's get into it. So, I'm a huge fan of trinkets, and I think that they're a really meaningful part of the game, and they've really become a big part of the game. So you roll on a trinket table during character creation, and you get a trinket. Now, for most players, they'll forget about this trinket. It'll remain in their pack for the entirety of a campaign, and they might not use it or even think about it. For others, though, they create some sort of backstory, something to go along with this trinket, a reason why it exists and why they have it. And for many, this can become a very important plot point, or at least character point, in their backstory. It's something that if you're a dungeon master and your players are giving you this, you might be able to tug on the player's heartstrings a little bit by playing on this affection for this particular bauble or trinket that they have in their pack. But I also think trinkets are an excellent way to enhance loot piles and enhance treasure and enhance stories in interesting and sometimes very weird ways. Now, of course, the sponge that the bride or would-be bride gave to one of my PCs in that first session was rolled from a random table. What I had done is I went and I found a bunch of random trinket tables online, and then I pulled them in, and I pulled about 20 that I thought were interesting, so I could just roll a d20 and have a random trinket. And I ended up using this a lot more than I initially thought that I would, because there's never a terrible time to just include some sort of interesting bauble or trinket. And again, much like with the ones that you roll during character creation, many of these that you end up handing out to the players, nothing might come of them. And that's okay, because they're very minor things. It's easy enough to put them in your pack and forget about them. But every time you give away one of these trinkets, depending on the situation, like at the wedding, it's a chance to create a story around it in a way that deepens the plot, that deepens the story, that gives the characters a little bit more depth. So when I rolled that sponge on my random trinket table and I handed it to my player, I was smiling like a lunatic, and he started laughing too, because he was thinking to himself, what in the world is she doing with a sponge, and why is this a family heirloom of a noble family of this city? And of course, I was thinking the exact same thing. But then the fun part, of course, was I got to come up with the reason why that sponge was meaningful to that family. Did it have a special ability? Did it have a power? Was it tied to their lineage in some way? And of course, it's a sponge, so whatever the story is, it's going to be a little bit goofy. But at the same time, I didn't have the answer to what is the reason for this sponge at that moment, but I certainly developed it. Now, as it turns out, they didn't end up going down a particular plot arc that would have gotten them more into a storyline with that bride and groom. So the sponge didn't end up really coming up much during play. But I did give it a magical ability. I think it was from that same trinket table where it said the sponge could only soak up blood. So they identified it somewhere in town. They were very low level at the time, so they couldn't do it themselves. They identified the sponge. They found out it could only soak up blood. So this was very interesting to the player, and he had some fun doing things like sucking the blood out of corpses after they had killed them, seeing if it had any combat use. And as he was figuring that out, I was sort of figuring it out as well. So it was this wonderful little improv tool for me to add something weird and strange to the story that I didn't expect. But it also was in a way that didn't detract from the other plot arcs that were going on. It wasn't something that ever distracted from it or became the focal point, which I think is a wonderful aspect of Trinkets. You can add little bits of flavor to the world without distracting from the story arcs that you have going on. So what are some of these types of narrative uses that I'm talking about? Well, if you have a particular villain in mind that you're going to use down the road, or maybe that you're using currently and is going to be a potentially recurring villain, you can start to have trinkets that suggest their involvement with other things that the players are involved in. This is a nice way to start to seed a story arc early on, and you don't have to know exactly how that villain or NPC is involved in the other things that your players are doing, and they don't necessarily need to know that either. You don't have to explain it all by the end, but eventually you should be able to give them enough clues so that they can figure out, oh, wait a second, is this linked to this? And is this linked to this? I tried to do this at one point with a series of clockwork trinkets. So it didn't end up working out exactly like I wanted to, but the players did start to think about it after they got like the second and third trinket that was very similarly crafted. So they started to realize that, oh, okay, there's something going on the fringes of our campaign. Someone's working either behind the scenes or nearby doing other things. And, we may come into contact with them at some point. And if you read through trinket tables, you're going to find a bunch that spark a bit of creativity where you start to think about, oh, how could this fit into a campaign? Why would it be important? And the important thing to remember is not every item needs to have a backstory to it, but it's an opportunity for you to be able to create a backstory around it if it serves your narrative, if it serves what you're trying to do in the campaign. So if I run a campaign and it's 30 sessions long, I might end up giving out 15 trinkets. And maybe only 4 or 5 of those really have any narrative purpose, but those 4 or 5 are going to have a very interesting narrative purpose. Let me give you one more example. A player in one of my campaigns came into a dog figurine, and I think he stole it from a tent that was selling a bunch of trinkets and baubles, and they didn't really like the person who was running this tent in a bazaar. It was like a market district, and so they ended up burning down the tent and stealing some stuff from it. He kind of deserved it, so my players weren't being too chaotic or evil, but they ended up stealing a number of trinkets, and one of them was this dog figurine that was warm to the touch. Again, this was something that I had found just on a random trinket table somewhere, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So the fun part then was he had this dog figurine. This character had a dog. So earlier in the campaign, he had said, I want to buy a dog. And I said, okay, fine, you have a dog. What breed of dog is it? What would you like to name him? And it was just this little puppy. And of course, as they went off on these adventures, he would leave the dog behind because the dog wasn't going to be combat ready or anything like that. So the dog was staying on a farm with some allies at the time when he got this trinket. So it gave me a little bit of time to think about what I could use this trinket for, because as soon as he got this dog trinket, it didn't have any powers attached to it on the trinket table that I had initially pulled it from. But the fact that he had a dog, and it certainly had some sort of low-level magic about it, got my gears turning. How can I turn this into something interesting? So once he reunited with his dog, it was a touching, fun scene. I got to RP a dog, which is always a lot of fun, and it was at that moment that his pack burst into flames because the heat of this dog figurine just became scorching. And he realizes that it's this trinket, and he throws it on the ground nearby, and it explodes again with arcane energy, and it infuses it into both himself and his dog. Now his dog gets thrown back, so he's worried, like, is the dog hurt? Is the dog dead? And he goes to check on the dog, and the dog's perfectly fine. And the dog turns to him and goes, Master, what just happened? And he realizes that the trinket has now allowed him to speak with his dog. He can't speak with any other animals, and when he checks the trinket, it's no longer warm to the touch. So it's lost whatever magical charge that it had. But he can now speak with his dog. So this didn't really have a huge mechanical benefit to the game. It was just something really fun for the player and for me. So anytime that he would show up with his dog, we got to have a fun little interaction where I was role-playing a dog and he was playing with his dog. And the important thing was, this didn't need to happen. Nothing about the story arc and the plot and the different character arcs and things like that would have been changed if this hadn't happened. But it was a really fun role-playing experience, and we got to have a whole mess of fun at the table, just screwing around, me RPing as a dog and him messing around with that. And the other players got into it as well because they realized that they couldn't hear the dog speak. All they heard was a dog barking. So from their perspective, it looked like this character had gone insane and was just barking back and forth with a dog. And I think there's a couple useful takeaways from this example that we can apply more universally to the use of trinkets within our games. The first is that if you have a trinket in a loot pile, you don't have to know what it does right away. Even if your characters or even if your players are higher level and say they have the identify spell and they immediately cast it on the trinket, it's well within your rights as a dungeon master to say, hey, I don't know what this does yet, or if it's even magical, let me get back to you on that, and then have an answer for that player in the next session. And the second takeaway is that these can be really fun ways to add to the story without doing anything that's going to meaningfully change the plot or break the game in some way. So is a trinket connected to a certain character or NPC that they know? Is it something that will give them some weird magical benefit, like being able to talk to their dog? So anytime you see a trinket, I think it should just be a chance to generate weird, fun, quirky ideas. And I think that's where their primary benefit is. And that's why it's one of the most fun things I get to give out in loot tables. If you're looking for further inspiration or some things along these lines that Wizards of the Coast has come up with, there's actually a fun list of minor magical items in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. A lot of these items are things like the Wand of Smiles, where you cast it on a person, and if they fail their saving throw, they're forced to smile, just have a big smile on their face for, I think it's 1 minute. I don't think it's too terribly long. It might be longer than that. Don't quote me on that. But the idea is it's something fun, it's quirky, it's not going to be something that you're using in combat. It's not going to give you a +3 whatever, but they can add a lot of flavor and excitement to the game, and they can offer opportunities for unique role playing. And lastly, if you're DMing and you've either used trinkets or are thinking about using more trinkets in some of the ways that I've talked about in this video, I would encourage you to roll them randomly. Don't select them in advance, because there can be a lot of fun that comes from the unknown and the unexpected. And I think something like a minor element like this can get you used to that improvisational style of gameplay, where you don't necessarily know everything that's coming in advance. You don't necessarily know how something that you do in this session will affect your players in 2 or 3 sessions down the road. One of the more fun things I got to do was figure out things like, how does this dog figurine play into this character? What is its magical ability? That was really exciting for me, that moment when I realized, oh, I'm definitely going to incorporate his dog into this trinket somehow. But it certainly wasn't something that I planned in advance, and I honestly don't think it would have been as fun if I had planned it in advance. It all happened during play, and we sort of figured it out as we went along, which was part of the fun, and I think part of the fun about D&D in general. So that's it. That is my video on trinkets. Down in the comments, let me know what's the favorite trinket that you've ever had or been given in the course of a campaign. Or if you're a DM, what's the coolest trinket you've ever given a player? How did it play out at the table? What interesting, cool thing were you able to do with it? I would love to hear some of those stories, because there are a ton of others. There are a bunch of others that I could tell outside of ones like the sponge or the dog. And the more I play, the more I find unique ways to use trinkets as well. So I'd love to hear those stories. And until next time, see you later.